Should we start with maybe not defining, but maybe defining, but also just trying to get a rudimentary understanding of like what are ESOPs?
Sure. We should start with that. So essentially, ESOPs are a tool which are non-cash based to compensate team members of a company. It could be a startup, it could be a listed company, it could be any organization which is incorporated. And the aim here is to defer compensation and compensate in form of stock so that there is future growth and ownership available to the team members for their contribution to the organization goals. That is what a startup sorry that is what a ESOP is. And again it's an interesting combination of a financial instrument and a right compensation instrument. And obviously it is much more structured and evolved as we see today across the spectrum of sizes, shapes, kinds of companies, not only in India but globally.
You mentioned so one thing you mentioned was it's a deferred compensation, right? So in a sense, like, so what is the motivation for the employee? So one thing which is very convenient or amazing about cash is that it's very it's immediate, right? Like you get cash in your hand and then you have the ability to, let's say, spend that either immediately, or you can maybe invest it in other things that you maybe are more enthusiastic about than let's say an ESOP plan. Like, since it's deferred, so why would the employees be kind of motivated to what is the motivation here from the employee side?
Right. So let me take an example of a startup which has raised seed funding. I'm just like this is a specific case, but would also serve as a general example. Now, obviously, there is limited cash available with the company. They need to attract and retain the best talent that they can. At the same time, as I said, there is a constraint on how much can they spend. Right. From a prospective employee's point of view, there is an opportunity to build something exciting, join a startup which would, for example, offer more flexibility, more freedom to operate, etc., etc. At the same time, ho- they would have an opportunity if the startup is successful to participate in the growth, and this would work. This talk about deferment would work only if the opportunity to participate in the growth is much bigger than what a cash component would afford. Right, that's the whole point. So obviously if I'm hiring someone, I'm a startup founder, I would have a budget which would essentially be determined by my cash flows, essentially my funding, right? And I would want to offer ESOPs so that I'm able to like I would just take a step back. I would be able to offer a cash compose, or I should be able to offer a cash compensation which is sufficient for someone to make this plunge in terms of maintaining a basic level of lifestyle to which they are accustomed to. Right, no one should be in stress about, for example, the school fee of kids or parents medicine, those kind of things. At the same time, the whole point of not getting that market compensation in cash is about having a much bigger pie in terms of the future gains from the ownership in the company. So essentially a trade-off and deferment for growth. That is how I would put it.
So if I understood correctly, so from the business side, you have limited resources and you have like restrictions on how much cash may be available, and you're kind of enticing prospective employees to kind of join in the growth of the company by providing them ESOPs maybe. And from the employee side, they get to participate in that growth. Like, one is obviously the cash component, but also if the company does well, they also get let's say to partake in that to partake in that growth uh, with with shares in that company itself. So did I get that right, or am I in the ballpark?
That's yeah, that's right. Essentially, the point here is to be able to build something and hence participate in that upsized growth.
Understood. So, so we'll jump around a little bit in the sense that, so when I'm looking at, so if I look at, let's say, AngelList or many of the hiring boards, maybe one thing which I feel like ESOP is not generally like stock options, or yeah, I think stock options is the right word, or ESOPs are generally not kind of detailed in the hiring of the candidate. Like if I look at any engineering roles, or engineering roles are most of what I've seen, but also I think marketing roles or product roles, it's very rare, I feel, as far as I've noticed on the job boards, maybe on LinkedIn or Google Jobs, maybe. They will have they will have like the description of the job, what kind of employee they're looking for. Compensation also will not be what is that will not be transparent, but ESOPs are also not advertised, and I don't know how many of my friends also have like ESOPs in the companies that they are kind of working in. So it feels like in India, not many startups do give ESOPs. Is that a fair assessment, or am I missing something?
On the contrary, very common. And as investors, any institutional investor coming into a company, right, the first institutional round that is getting raised, the investors would always ask for creation of a ESOP pool, right? So essentially, the founders have to set aside a certain percentage of equity. This could vary between 8 to 15%, commonly 10%, around 10%, to be able to offer ESOPs. And these pools, depending on the needs of the company, depending on what kind of talent they need as the company evolves, they would this could need to be replenished, it could need to be repurposed, etc., etc. So I would say fairly common, because that is the whole excitement, that if I am, for example, going to work for a startup which is promising to build something which is impactful and meaningful, I should be able to participate, and right, and not only contribute but also derive benefits from that growth. So what typically happens is, coming to the specific point, now obviously it's a part of the compensation discussion, right? It will be dictated by the ESOP policy that the company has. And as you rightly said in the very beginning, right, many people would not be, let us say, enthused by ESOPs, because they would have, or they could have, priorities which won't allow them the freedom, right, to forsake a part of the cash compensation and right, drive it towards future. But at the same time, there is always, I would say, there is a clear trend, and there is a clear, I would say, ESOPs are a very clearly a part of the standard compensation that would be offered, especially to the early members of the team, because that is when you don't have enough cash. The startup is at its, like, just the beginning of the journey, and that is where outsized contributions would matter, right? As you go along, the percentages could shrink, because you would find fitments for specific roles. You could drive seniority, it could be milestone based, it could be, multiple things that could happen at that point in time.
Um, so if we have established that ESOPs are important, both from the business side and the employee side, what is the way to kind of maybe design that plan, like design that structure or design the ESOP plan itself? Is there like a standard way that everybody does it, or are there different ways to kind of align incentives for different players, or how does that generally work?
No, so ultimately incentives would need to be designed basis specific situations of the employer and the employee, right? Now, as far as the regulatory framework is concerned, of how do you design, how do you adopt, how do you implement an ESOP, that again is now fairly well settled. Even the taxation over past few years has evolved and is, settled in a sense. Now, obviously, every company would design its ESOP scheme and its ESOP structure, keeping in mind its cap table, right? Its talent requirements, and whatever is their thought process around human resources. How do they want to develop it? So that would be the cornerstone of the ESOP policy, right? Typically, the company would start the starting point would be a discussion around the size of the ESOP pool that would need to be created, right? Because ultimately it is expensive. It's a very expensive form of compensation as well, because the founders and the investors are diluting themselves. They are giving up equity in favor of others, which is an equity. The basic assumption, right, and it works both ways, is that equity would be valuable down the line, right? So once you have determined the size of the ESOP pool, you would define like who gets what, and this is ideally communicated and set in terms of the percentages or units of ESOPs rather than value, because value is uncertain, right? The ESOPs, and we have sufficient stories that ESOPs were not worth anything because the startup did not succeed at a certain point in time, or stocks had to be repriced, etc., etc. Schemes had to be redrawn. All of that keeps on happening. But the whole point here is that there would be a certain allocation which should be made basis, for example, longevity, basis seniority, basis the contribution, basis the trade-off between cash and options. All of these would be built into the scheme, right? And obviously there are three stages. One is the grant, where an employee is communicated that you are being allotted a certain number of stock options which would vest. So even if, for example, I am granted 100 units of ESOPs, these would vest typically over a period of time, let's say 3 to 4 years. So every year, for example, 25 units will vest into me. So I get the right of ownership on options only upon vesting, right? And this too comes after a certain cliff. Cliff essentially means a certain minimum period which needs to elapse before the vesting schedule kicks in. So typically it's a 3 to 5 year kind of a vesting schedule overall from the grant to grant is the employee or the team member getting a letter stating their allocation, vesting of that allocation every year in a certain proportion as might be determined by the policy. Vesting could be milestone based, it could be time based. There are various mechanisms to do it. Ultimately there would be a point of exercise. So ESOPs are vested into me, I need to exercise them. Now exercise has a very interesting, or rather a perverse scenario, where if I were to exercise, I have to pay for and get shares against the options, because ultimately ESOPs are stock options. I have the option to buy shares into the company at a certain price, which typically is below the actual value of the share price of the company. That's the whole point. Otherwise I would buy, right, from wherever. Now this exercise, you, at the point of exercise, there will be a tax, because I am getting something from the company at lower than its market value. It will be added as a perquisite, and the employee would be required to pay tax, and the company would need to deduct, obviously, withholding tax and deposit it with the government. Now, what this does is you only have shares which are illiquid at that point in time, mostly, right? And you need to pay cash out towards tax. Obviously the government has also realized this is that the oddity of this situation, and they have also, for example, introduced new rules in the budget which pushed out the exercise date, or rather the date of payment. But even then it needs to be done at the point of 5 years, completion of 5 years or the employee leaving. Okay, so these are the two broad conditions where tax needs to be paid.
Um, like, what happens if the employee leaves? Let's say, I exercise my options for the first year of, like, in your example of 100.
Right.
In the first year, I do get my 25 options, let's say. And for whatever reason, I end up leaving the company or the country. And so, what happens to those? Can I offer them back to the company itself, or are they just, void?
So what would happen is, suppose I have, let's say, 25% of my options vested, and I decide to leave the company for whatever reasons. Right. Now I have right to buy 25 shares from the company. That is what I have got. Right. And which me and at the time of leaving the company, I will need to exercise, which means I will have to pay towards buying those shares, whatever is the strike price, as is the term used, and I will have to pay tax. Now, as you pointed out, the company could choose to buy. There could be a liquidity which could be made available, right? The employee might choose or decide that it is not worth to be cash out for this kind of a amount. So typically, interestingly, what also happens is many employees, when they're changing companies, they're changing their jobs. Very common in tech, they would negotiate their compensation with their prospective employer basis the kind of ESOPs that they would have to give up, because that's a loss which is attributable, but obviously it is not quantified, or it is not accrued, but at the same time this is something which enters the negotiation as well. So no good options here unless the company is generous enough, and they have a firm belief in the value of their equity, and they would want to buy out as a gesture of goodwill to the employee. It could also be for practical considerations that they are getting shares back into the pool for cheap. Typically, if ESOPs are not, after vesting, if they are not exercised, they would lapse and go back into the pool so that the replacement employee or other team members can get that benefit.
You mentioned something called strike price. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? What is that?
Yes, yes. So so to take a step back, ESOPs that an employee is getting are options to buy shares from the company at a certain price. This price is called strike price. That is the price at which the employee would be buying shares and the company would be selling shares to him or her. This strike price is typically, as I had said earlier, would be lower than the fair value of the shares of the company. For example, if the company is listed and the stock is trading at 100 rupees in the market, possibly the employee would be given a strike price of, let's say, 80 rupees. So they are in the money the moment they buy. Of course, they will be taxed on the differential because they are getting something at a lower value, which is actually valued higher. So this is the concept of the strike price, the price at which essentially you buy the shares.
You also mentioned something about repricing ESOPs. Like, why would that happen, and, like, what are the consequences of that?
Now, what happens in some situations is that maybe the company goes through a down round. This is one situation, right? Or the company restructures. Let us say the options were offered at a strike price of, let's say, 200 rupees per share, right? The new round, for whatever reasons, happens at a price of, let's say, 150 rupees a share. So in technical terms, this stock or the options are under the water. They are in loss. If someone were to exercise the options, they would be sitting on a actual loss, right? Because they are buying something for 150 rupees, or rather 200 rupees, which is now worth 150 rupees. So one way to deal with this kind of situation is to reprice the options. So either amend the current policy or adopt a new ESOP scheme, factoring for the current state of the cap table, factoring for the current valuation of the company, so that employee, I mean, otherwise, like, no one would exercise the options. I mean, they would remain on paper. If the company still wants the employees to be motivated and to be geared towards ownership, sometimes people would do this. It's essentially a signal that the company still values the employees and is willing to make amends to whatever is the pricing, so that their rights are taken care of, or rather their interests are taken care of.
When you're talking about exercising options, like we hear a lot about companies being like, there are multiple fundraising rounds, as we discussed in the last episode as well. When you talk about liquidity, I understand like the employees are also able to sell their shares during that, let's say during that other round, right? And that's how they can also get liquidity as well, no?
Right, right. So one thing is to acquire shares in a company through stock option. The other thing is to generate liquidity. Now, typically, a company would want to align the timelines so that the employees are able to actually benefit. Benefit doesn't remain on paper. So during a round, it is now becoming increasingly common to structure a round so that there is some ESOP or MSOPs which could be given back or bought back. And typically, like, this prevents dilution beyond a point, because these are shares which are actually existing in existence, so no new shares need to be created. The incoming investors can get either at the same price or maybe at a discount to the to the round, small discount to the round price, right? Founders don't suffer dilution, founders and other shareholders, and everyone is happy.
And like typically if I have my ESOPs, like in general, if I have my options, in general, like will I be able to see any money, let's say in 3 years, or in let's say 2 years? Generally, like what's the timeline? Because I think one sentiment is like, what I've heard at least from my friends is like,
Mhm.
ESOPs might be very like, value in like, uh, as mentioned earlier as well, like their value might fluctuate dramatically, or sometimes they might be worthless as well in the future, because we never know what company will succeed and what company will be the next Facebook, right? So sometimes, so like in that sense, like what do you think, how quickly do you think they'll be able to see money, or in
So typically liquidity options would be available, as you rightly pointed out, uh, would be available towards a new round happening, where there are new investors who are coming in, right? Because that's a big event, and this is fairly event driven. What could also happen is there could be other opportunities to sell shares in secondary, although these are private companies and companies would want to restrict to whom the shares are being sold, all for good reasons, right? But uh, typically, one would need to wait for liquidity events, which could be 2 to 3 years away from the point you're exercising. And to think of it, this is actually one of the key reasons why you would have ESOPs, right? You would want to retain your team members and keep them motivated to contribute towards the growth of the firm.
what did you mean when you said they could sell it in the secondary? Like how does that work?
So an incoming investor who is putting money in the company, right? To take my favorite number, 100 rupees per share, instead of putting, let's say they are investing, let us say, 1 lakh rupees, just using arbit numbers. Instead of putting 1 lakh rupees into the company, they might put 95,000 rupees into the company, directly into the company, and get new shares allotted to them. And for 5,000 rupees they could buy out shares from ESOP holders, from the team, right? So the company is not diluting a lot, and the incoming investor is getting their target stake, or meeting their stake targets. The stockholders or ESOP holders are getting exit option, so works well in that sense. Although it is debatable why someone who is coming into the company might, would not want to put money directly into the company for the growth of the company and give exit to other people, right? That's another angle, but these are all like discussed and structured as as a part of the round.
Um, so in terms of like exit, are those the only options? Like one is when new investors come in, you get to like let's say liquidate your shares. I think another is like I think if the company goes public, also I think you'll be able to maybe sell and
Oh
liquidate.
yes, yes. IPO is a big event in life of the company in any case, right? And we have seen and we have heard all these stories, which are now urban legends, of, let's say, Infosys drivers getting ESOPs, etc., etc. But definitely, if the company lists, right, then these shares become tradable and marketable, and these could be sold on the exchange directly, right? Then there is immediate liquidity available without any intermediation, right? You could just sell on the exchange.
In terms of so I feel in terms of like some of these terms that you mentioned like strike price and repricing that happens, I feel like a lot of it is like very complicated. And when like if you're an employee working at any company, you're just going there as like a graphic designer or let's say a software engineer, and you only know your Python and you only know how to let's say work
Right.
your Excel or something. Like how can people get to know about these concepts, or even maybe negotiate well when they are doing their salary discussions, and maybe bringing up ESOPs and all that. So how do you think people should approach it?
Right. So two parts to this. Obviously, one part is when I am a team member, I am getting ESOPs. Typically, typically all good companies would do this, is that they would explain what actually it means to get ESOPs in terms of all the technical terms and conditions, how the exits could happen, what are the tax implications, right? What do these specific terms mean? What is the process? What is the documentation, right? And communicate that very clearly and as vividly as possible to all the team members. If need be, in a one-on-one setting, and have someone designated within the team or maybe an external agency who would be able to deal with any questions or any issues on an ongoing basis till such time there is complete clarity and there is complete knowledge dissemination around the ESOP scheme. That is one. Now, obviously, if you are on the outside, right, and looking to enter a company, there will be desk research and there is enough material available in public domain, right? There are various podcasts which, right, all there is enough. I mean, if someone were to Google, they would find enough resources, case studies to be able to make themselves familiar with what is being spoken about. But the first practice is of utmost importance, that the company takes upon the responsibility of communicating and clarifying any doubts, any questions, etc., for the employees. Especially because not everyone, as you rightly pointed out, would be financially savvy or be familiar with these terms.
Is it a red flag if the company is not offering ESOPs to its early employees?
No, as far as, see again, it's a I would say a market, right? There are buyers of services and there are sellers of services, right? If someone is not happy with the compensation, right, they would not join a company, obviously. Although it is now widely accepted that one should be broad basing the ownership into the company and making more and more like team members come together and participate in the growth of the company. So I would not say if someone is being fairly compensated, I mean they would be happy about it, right? I mean they would not care beyond the point. But at the same time, it is important, and it's a standard practice nowadays to, as I said, broad base ownership and participate in growth and profits.
Are there ways it could go wrong, in the sense like are there any like it feels like till now we've only kind of discussed the upsides, and I feel like there are only upsides about ESOPs. are there any downsides, or in the sense that where ESOPs, where allocation of ESOPs could go wrong, and instead of having employees who are motivated, you get the opposite effect, where people are just disgruntled and not happy with how much they have or how much their peers might have?
Yeah, two, three situations, and one situation we already discussed, right? That the company is not doing as well, the price is falling, right? And ESOPs would lose the meaning or the value, right? Unless the management decides to do something about it. That is actually demotivating, that you put in work and the value is destroyed in that manner. The other situation, again, as you pointed out, it could be that someone who comes in today is offered a certain proportion of ESOP, which is higher than what, for example, original team member. I'm taking extreme cases. Someone who joined, who was employee number, single digits, has spent a fair bit of time in the company, but his ESOP allocation is not as high. All of this can happen, and it should, if it does, it should happen for a good reason. That, let us say the company has grown from 1 to 10, right? And you need a new CEO, for example, who would be able to lead the company on that path from 10 to 100, right? And obviously, if someone is coming in at that level with requisite experience, with requisite seniority, they would hope to have some ownership. And at the same time, the founders and the management would also want to ensure that a part of, or rather a larger part of the compensation is indexed towards stock options rather than cash, not only for conserving cash but also for ensuring motivation, right? And the flip side could be that some existing team members could not, would have a lower percentage, etc., etc. This could happen, this happens, but at the same time, everyone, I mean, you need, it is very clear that for junior employees, companies and typically HRs would index more towards cash and lesser relatively towards ownership. Whereas in case of senior employees, senior level employees, not senior in terms of longevity or tenure, there would be an emphasis or shift towards stock based compensation. And it is also a function of the wealth that someone would have, the means that they would have to sustain their lifestyle. So, for example, you might have passive income which would allow you to work only for, let's say, ownership of a company with a token compensation. I might not have that luxury, and I might need to prioritize cash, right? And not, even if I want to, I might not be able to go towards holding shares into the company. So those are very specific and personal situations, and would vary, right? Because there are no formulas which a company can apply. There is no HR tool which can measure, or which can straight jacket all of this, or rather put everything into one box. So the only way to deal with this, to have a policy which would allow for some expect some exceptions, but at the same time is fair, is equitable, and is, as I said earlier, is communicated well, so that everyone understands what they are getting. I think there are no clear answers, or there are no clear formulas which can be applied.
Um, so even though you said there are no clear answers, in terms of like for businesses or for employers, do you have any recommendation as to like, or the way you think about how maybe it's best for companies to allocate? Um, one thing you mentioned obviously was for senior members, it might you might lean heavily onto ESOPs or more than junior members. So that's maybe like one into a heuristic that can be applied.
Yeah.
Any other ways you think about maybe maximizing the like efficiency of ESOPs and their incentive?
No, sure. Great question. So one obviously is seniority, in terms of the seniority of the role. Other could be milestone or delivery based, right? That vesting of ESOPs is basis the company achieving a certain milestone. So, for example, for a CFO, it could be the company, CFO of a company which is nearing IPO. It could be the company getting in readiness for filing the DRHP with SEBI. That could be one. I'm just like making it up, right? And obviously, third is opportunity cost, as we discussed. So, to my mind, there'll be these three parameters, and effective policy would be an interplay between these three parameters.
We have spoken mostly about startups today. Does that also mean that ESOPs in general is most effective to like startup companies and maybe tech companies, or are there different segments or different sort of companies where ESOPs may be effective, if not more effective than let's say startups that we discussed?
No, definitely. So we have enough case studies in India where large listed companies, right? There was a wave when most of these companies realized the importance of ESOPs, right? And broad-based their plans or offered ESOPs to the employees. We have companies like Infosys, which are legendary in that sense. At the same time, they're even right traditional conservative business houses like Tata's, SDFC, etc., etc. They've had very active ESOP plans. ICICI Bank is a very good name in that sense, where they have used ESOPs very effectively to to generate that kind of traction and momentum within the team members, especially the key contributors, to align them to the organization goals. So it is not only a startup thing, it's a wider thing. And I would say it is not dependent on the, I would say, stage or nature of the business, more so to do with the management philosophy. How do they want to drive their key performers and compensate them, right? And also, and you had alluded to this in some sense, ESOPs are also a very key tool to attract talent, right? For example, expat senior manager coming into and joining a traditional business house, right, would need to be motivated by getting a share of the ownership. So it depends on how the management or the existing holders, it could be investors, it could be founders, it could be whoever else, are thinking about structuring their HR policies.
I want to go back to pricing a little bit in the sense that so I'm not very clear about this, but I'm kind of contrasting this to like public markets where sometimes there is like a mania, or there is like in the sense that prices of public equities are extremely high, and then people might want to like sell, or in the sense there might be a lot of people who might be interested in selling, and does that kind of things happen? Do those kind of things happen in like private like in private companies as well, where there might be like a mismatch in terms of pricing and people want to take advantage, and that might eventually lead to like problems in the company, or because it's private those kind of things are rarely happen, and such kind of lot of mania is not very prevalent in private companies.
Yeah, your question has the answer, because private companies are private because obviously they restrict their shares or their stock being traded. There is no platform or there is no market in these shares till such time you actually have a transaction, right? So I might feel, or I might have a valuation certificate by a valuer which says that, okay, this is a DCF projection which factors for, let's say, of 10 years of growth, and terminal value which is X amount of that last year. The stock is valued at a certain level, but ultimately that level will be achieved only if there is a willing buyer and there is a willing seller. So it will be dictated purely by the market and not by the buying or selling pressures. That won't happen, because and what is also happening, and possibly India would also move in that direction, that there will be specialist buyers or platforms which would enable trades in ESOPs. Right, that would be an interesting business idea per se, but at the same time, that doesn't happen too often. So in short, you are in an illiquid market till such time there is an event, which is why these liquidity events become very important. because that is when the pricing would be, fairly assessed and determined. And that is when there will be opportunities to for actual transactions to happen.
Any you spoke about tax earlier as well, but anything else you maybe want to touch on tax um, that we may not have brought up before?
No, again, like, just to touch base on this. Now, there are two levels of taxation involved with ESOPs. One is when there is exercise. So, in my earlier example, when I am buying shares of a company at 80 rupees, whereas the fair market value of those shares is 100 rupees. So, I'm getting a benefit of 20 rupees, which is being given to me by my employer by virtue of my employment. So, this will be taxed as a perquisite. I will need to pay tax as a part of my salary. That is one point of taxation. Now, when I am selling the shares that I am holding, I will suffer another level of taxation. Suppose I have now these shares, and there is a new round happens and prices these shares at 200 rupees. So I will be taxed at the fair market value and my cost. So this will be capital gains, which obviously would be taxed at a lower rate, assuming that there would be a certain period of holding which is involved. So two level of taxation which gets triggered in case of startups, or sorry, in case of ESOPs, whenever these are being transacted.
Any governance issues that might prop up because of I don't know, ESOP plans um, or the way they are either implemented. Do companies need to I don't know, set up governance when they are planning all this?
Yes, definitely, and there are quite a few. Like if one were to Google, you would come across issues, etc. But typically, there is a regulatory framework which governs the startups for listed companies as well as unlisted companies. So, so ESOPs have to be governed by a policy which would be framed in accordance with the provisions of the company's law and the rules that are framed under the company's law. Right? So you can't do much, on that front. ESOP schemes have to be confined to that broad framework which companies law provide. Of course, there is enough flexibility which could be built in to factor for the commercial discretion that the company and the employees might wish for. So that is there. Now, how the management treats, for example, I mean, if there is a round happening and the management decides to sell their own shares ahead of the ESOP holders, now that, right, conflicts, typical conflict situations, which are not as common but can definitely happen, right? Or ESOPs are not, even if these are vested, the exercise is deferred, etc., etc. The terms are changed midway by changing the policy, amending the policy as per the process laid on. All of the this has happened. It is not uncommon, right? So, so governance issues could come up, but these are like any other governance issues. These are not, if there are governance issues in the company, they could manifest in various ways, not necessarily in the startups, or sorry, ESOP schemes.
So shall we begin with like alternatives to ESOPs? Like are there any other options available besides ESOPs, or how to think about that?
Yes. So two other options which are not as common and for for valid reasons. So one is what you would call RSUs, or restricted stock units, which is essentially stock which is given as most likely to a very senior team member, right, a CXO, etc., when he joins a company, but can't be like sold as freely till such time certain milestones or certain tenure requirements are met, right? And obviously you don't want to do this because you don't want to like issue shares, and it is, I mean, issuing shares is again a dilutive event. It needs, someone has to pay for the shares. All of those considerations kick in, right? Options vest over a period of time and exercise, so there is a certain lag which is already built in, which can be tied to the performance or whatever are the goals that the firm has. That is one. The other way, which appears to be much simpler, is something called SARs or stock appreciation rights, which is essentially a contract between an employee and an employer, that if the business performs and there are certain metrics or certain milestones which are met, right, and the share price moves in a certain direction, the equivalent gains basis, I mean, there could be complicated formulas, it could be a simple index, etc., would be given to the employee in cash as bonus. Now on paper this sounds like brilliant, right, and easy, especially from the employee. But issue here is that these are contractual, whereas stock options are statutory instruments. Options are issued in accordance with Companies Act, right? Shares are issued, etc., which have a very clear title and ownership once you have. In case of contract, I mean, contract is a contract. It's a piece of paper. Depends on the intent and the ability of the parties to perform, right? Which is why we don't see these as often. Although these could be alternatives to to ESOPs in certain situations.
Um, could we could we go a little deeper on the vesting? Like, I have like multiple terms here. Like, one is cliff vesting, monthly vesting, accelerated vesting as well. Could you
Right.
maybe give us an idea of or flavor of like what do these like how to think about vesting maybe?
Sure, definitely. So once a company decides कि okay, I mean employee X, you would be eligible to get 100 units of options, which would entitle you in turn to 100 shares at a certain point in time. Now so this is called grant. Grant is essentially a letter from the company to the employee stating that they are being granted these options, which will vest into them over a period of time in a certain manner. Vesting means that theoretically I am eligible for these options, but these are given to me only in a phased manner over a period of time. These could be monthly, as you said monthly vesting. So, for example, if there are, let us say, 100, just to like make the numbers and calculation simple, let us say an employee is eligible for 120 options, right, and these vest into him or her over 3 years with a cliff of 1 year. Cliff means that there will be a gap between the grant and the point in time where vesting would kick in. Start that clock will start ticking. So the employee in this case would need to wait for 1 year, which is the cliff period, after which, let us say it is yearly vesting. Every year they will, over 3 years, they will get 40 options vested into them, so that at the end of the third year, or rather fourth year, 1 plus 3, they would have all the options to which they were eligible to vested into them or owned by them, right? So title of these options are now owned by the employee. This could be monthly as well. So it could be, for example, over a period of, let's say, 120 options over a period of 24 months, theoretically. So every month you would have a 120 by 24, which is essentially five options getting vested into them, right? So this will be monthly vesting. It would take other forms. A certain part could vest at a certain, milestone base. It could be time based. So there are multiple ways for doing it. It could also be that, let us say, there is a time period of 3 to 4 years of vesting, but if certain events happen, the vesting can be accelerated. Or let us say, even in case of let a company has a stock plan which which determines vesting over a period of 3 years, but the company onboards a CEO or another senior talent who demands and is given the option of having the vesting done earlier. We'll let us say instead of 3 years, the vesting needs to happen over 1 year or 1.5 years. This will be called accelerated vesting. The typically the stock plans will have provisions for these accelerated vestings determined by the ESOP committee or whatever other governing committee of the ESOP plans. So there are different modes in which vesting can happen, and there could be some linkages created to the business conditions or other such conditions. For example, the example that I took, a senior employee joining and having demanding an early vesting of his shares, those kind of things. Because ultimately what happens is, till such time the options are vested into an employee, right? He doesn't have any right on those shares. If his if he were to leave, right, he would leave empty handed, or he would leave, for example, if he leaves midway, he would only have part of his or her options vested into them, and again they will have to exercise since they are leaving, the employment is getting terminated.
Are there any operational like consideration that we might have to make while thinking about ESOPs?
Yes, because for the company, right, to operate the ESOP scheme, it takes operate design, it takes a lot of work. So it is possible that in many cases, and these are stories that we have heard, that for example employees were offered ESOPs but said that the company will implement the ESOP scheme at a later point in time. We are too small, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the resources to create these structures, etc., etc. And then something changed or the employee left and the promise was unfulfilled. And this also ties in with your earlier point around governance, that it is best to have a clearly defined policy which is adopted by the board, which is articulated, documented, right? Operationally, the company will need to issue letters of grant. They would need to track vesting, right, and issue the options. They would have to take care of the withholding tax obligations, etc. when exercise happens. So there is a lot of work which the organization will need to put in to make the ESOP scheme work. So there is a lot of operational work, and at the same time, from the organization's point of view, you don't want to have a very crowded cap table, right? You don't want to have 200 names on the cap table, because obviously later investors coming into, they would find it very hard to digest this. So it is important that ESOP schemes are managed smartly, in a prudent way, with a fair set of practices and principles, and at the same time the company has a view on keeping ESOPs limited and not very democratic or very widely spread out, because there is a certain operational and governance load which comes with this, right? The company is taking a lot of obligation, and there is an accounting impact as well, because as I said, right, ESOPs are deferred compensation. It has to be recognized via the P&L. So all of this needs a lot of management input and management effort as well. And in many cases, typically, like, companies would need to work with some advisors, external advisors, etc., to operate and conceptualize.